Hello, I'm pleased to introduce you to this new interview of 30 Minutes With. 30 Minutes With is a series of interviews with African policymakers, activists, academics, artists on current African issues. So today we are going to discuss women, peace and security in Africa. And to discuss this issue, we have an eminent researcher academic on that topic. So Prof. Cheryl Hendricks, thank you for accepting our invite. Professor Hendricks is Professor of Politics and International Relations since 2013 at the University of Johannesburg. Before that, she was a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Peace Security Studies, where she focused on issues of women, peace and security sector governance. She has also worked at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation for the Center for Conflict Resolution, where she spent many years teaching in the Political Studies department. She also taught at the University of Western Cape. She holds a PhD from the University of South Carolina in Government and International Relations and an MA from the University of York in Southern African Studies. Welcome, Professor Hendricks. So when we discuss about women, peace and security, how would you explain those concepts to the ordinary person? What is women, peace and security, especially in the African context?
When we speak about women, peace and security, we're speaking about the agenda to create increased participation for women in peace and security processes and structures. We are talking about creating gender responsive peace, gender sensitive peace, so that peace and security is not just the domain for men and to see to men's interests, but to cater for peace and security of everybody in a particular society. In a nutshell, that is what the peace and security agenda is about, right? If we have to define it. Obviously, it draws on concepts like gender, it draws on concepts like peace and security. So gender, we know, is the socially constructed identities associated with men and women. Come about, in particular, cultural contexts as well. So they differ slightly from context to context, as opposed to our biological identification with sex. Peace, we draw on John Galton's definition of peace, which is broader than what we call negative peace, right? Just the absence of violence, the absence of war, the absence of conflict. We are talking about positive peace, so we deal with issues related to structural violence. You can only create peace by dealing with issues such as sexual and gender-based violence, such as poverty, such as the health issues, all those other things that create insecurity in society. So the definition of security that we work with is also the broader definition of security. So security, as we know, shifted from simply creating security through the projection of power, which was the realist conceptualization of security. You create deterrence, for example, by building up your army, by projecting power. So we'd see militaries, for example, we'd see their missiles in pretty much the same way as North Korea has been demonstrating their military capability over the past few years. We've shifted from that to saying security is about having choice. It is about emancipation, right? It's about freedom. That is what security is. It is the human security paradigm defined it very nicely for us. They said security is freedom from fear, freedom from want, and later freedom to live in dignity. Now, Fumi Olanisakan came up with another definition, and I like to use that definition. And she says it is to live long and to live well, because that particular definition speaks to these other issues that create insecurity. Because what must you have to live long? What must you have within your society to live well? Okay? And you can have all of that, but not live in dignity. So the idea of living in dignity, for example, not having your body violated is an important
bodily
concept,
integrity
that we also work with. In the year 2000, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 was adopted. And this particular resolution, we say, is the landmark resolution for women, peace and security. That resolution called for women's participation in peace processes, particularly at decision-making level. It called for the protection of women during conflict, and it called for the prevention of things like sexual and gender-based violence during conflict, but also we've extended it into the post-conflict situations, because we're not only dealing with insecurity in a conflict situation, there are many other insecurities in a post-conflict situation, and then also to ensure that relief and recovery was gender sensitive. A suite of other resolutions was adopted afterwards that spoke more to issues around sexual and gender-based violence and preventing the impunity with which this particular topic was dealt with, bringing civil society more into the processes, talking about transitional justice, talking about new emerging issues like violent terrorism, violent extremism or terrorism. That is the dominant peace and security issue at the moment.
And how about the African context?
And in the African context, we must remember firstly that it was African women highlighting their experiences in Liberia, for example, in Sierra Leone, in the DRC, as well as those in civil wars in Eastern Europe, that got this agenda going, that kind of activism, the peace builders that were associated with those particular contexts. So there was that activism that was taking place.
In the Mano River region, for example.
In the Mano River region, for example. Besides that activism, within the policy-making space, the United Nations and the African Union was very concerned. Here it goes our DRC, rape as a weapon of war, Bosnia, rape as a weapon of war. Look at all of these civilians that have been targeted here. Look at the displacement of people, for example, with IDPs. How do we deal with this? Because this has been beamed into our lounges in the early 1990s. We needed a way in which to be able to respond to this. I noted the scholarship, I noted the activism, and I noted the policymakers. And it was that confluence that was enabled the women's peace and agenda to emerge. And so in the African context, we had, just prior to the adoption of 1325, the Windhoek Declaration, speaking about women in peacekeeping in particular, and arguing for more women to be part of peacekeeping missions. It was when Namibia was chair of the UN Security Council that they introduced this topic. Remember, women's issues were never discussed in that particular body. And when Namibia, and it was a woman who was the ambassador there at the time, the representative, when she said that this was the topic for discussion, obviously the men were, where are we going to with this, etc. But with much persuasion, they discussed it, and that is how you got the adoption of 1325. The following year, it was South Africa that pushed for 1820, for example. So Africans have been at the forefront of pushing for this particular agenda as well, because most of the conflicts are on the African continent. Was then is still now. Most of the peacekeeping missions, 10 of the 16 peacekeeping missions, are situated on this particular continent. And so the African Union also picked up on this. And in its protocol, the Maputo Protocol, it speaks to the issue of women, peace and security. In the Solemn Declaration, they speak to it. In the gender policy, they speak to it. They started a gender program. They appointed a special envoy for women, peace and security. So it's very much on the agenda of the African Union, for example. When Madame Dlamini Zuma was appointed as chair of the African Union, she was passionate about this particular topic. And so she did a lot, I think, to push the gender agenda at the African Union at the time, in particular this issue around women, peace and security. I think we have been stagnating.
And you've told us earlier, since you are taking part in this governance and development residential school, it was a very lively session, and you've told us about all the implementation and legal frameworks legal framework that exist. But how come there is this implementation gap? What can explain that? Is it cultural? Is it lack of policy will? How can we explain that?
Okay, so people usually point to an implementation gap. Here we have all these frameworks, but we are not seeing them being implemented. The first thing I always like to note is we have an implementation gap, not just on gender frameworks, but also on all our policies, right? We have wonderful policies that we very rarely implement. So this is just another example of that implementation gap. But there's an added factor here, in that the first national action plans that were produced did not have budgets assigned to it. And you know that if you're in government, if there's no budget, it's not going to be implemented. The second was very weak accountability mechanisms. How do we keep our national governments up to account? How do we keep the African Union or even the UN to account for the implementation of this? Besides just reporting that we have done or have not done this. If you have not done this, what else can we do? Can we have unsigning ceremonies? Because we have such wonderful
signing ceremonies.
Can we have some unsigning ones, right? Political will is always a challenging concept. Because how do you measure whether there's political will or not? Is it simply a lack of political will when we don't see implementation, or are there other factors, other priorities, pressing priorities, competing priorities at play within a particular country? So there are a lot of things to weigh up. But if we as women don't push the agenda, nobody else is going to do it for us. So we can't rest on our laurels once we have our national action plan and say we've done that. How do we ensure implementation ourselves? We cannot say, government, you have not implemented. It's not just government's responsibility to implement, it is all our responsibility to implement. So that is a big challenge around implementation.
And another big challenge you explained to us earlier was that there is like in many other areas, a glass ceiling. So how come there are only 9% of women as peace and security negotiators globally? And you also said that in the DRC, for example, out of almost 20,000 troops, only less than 500 were female and 158 policy officers. How come?
Why are we not moving on the agenda?
Yes.
Okay. So the first statistic is a report by UN Women on peace agreements, and they say that 27% of peace agreements actually do mention women, irrespective of whether women participated or not. But if you think about it, 27% is not a lot, right? and the 9% as negotiators, the first question we have to ask ourselves as women, how do you get to a negotiating table? Because we can scream and shout that we want to be at the peace table, but until we understand the dynamics of who sits at the table, we're not going to make much headway. And so very often these days we protest, we are allowed in, but we come in as observers. Okay? Who elects the mediators? Let's just stay at mediators. Okay? So here we have the United Nations, we have the African Union, with all their declarations and all their frameworks saying they want to include women. They do not select women as mediators, right? Because they elect the mediators and they're not doing so. Is it because there are no women mediators? Who are these mediators? If we look at them, they tend to be former presidents. Have you noticed that? Mostly former presidents or very senior ranking political officers. We've only had 9 presidents as women. The few senior women, I think, for example, of Gracia Michelle, she has mediated before. There are very few women to begin with, if we go by the way in which they select mediators to begin with. Then the pool is very small. The second thing we need to know is that the warring parties have a say in who the mediator should be. And that is not at the top of their agenda, right? The person that they think is going to be most favorable to them, that would be the person. So if we are saying we want to be at that table as mediators, training is not going to do it. So what we've invested in is training, capacity building, train them how to be mediators, etc., without understanding the political dynamic. So all we're doing is putting our names on rosters. I have trained, I'm available, but very few are being called. We have to change the whole dynamic of the selection of mediators to begin with. That's point number 1. Point number 2, in terms of representatives at this particular table, those with the ability to do harm, those are the people who will be at the table. The people who are leading warring factions. Are we in that position? No. Right? So what must we do? Must we now go and form armies, get guns, do exactly the same thing to get there? No. Okay? Well, we don't have to do that. We can say, and which is what we have been saying, as you are discussing things beyond ceasefire agreements here. If it was just about a ceasefire, we can understand why these particular people are here. But you're actually talking about reconstituting a particular society. We form half of that society. Therefore, our interests, our needs need to be reflected in the kind of peace agreement that is being generated here. That's the argument we've been making, but not much has been coming forth in terms of getting us there beyond observers. Now here again, I point to the very institutions who produce these resolutions. Because, okay, say you don't have leeway on the mediator. You do have leeway on the terms of reference of those mediators. So in the terms of reference of the mediators, you can say you need X number of women at the table and stipulate where those particular women need to come from. They have that power to do it. They have not exercised it sufficiently. And so we have not seen movement there. A key question also goes, why do we want to be in that space? And legitimate the kind of elite pacting that has been taking place there and distribution of power. Do we simply want to engage in that? Or do we want to transform the way we actually make peace in our society.
And that was the next question. Should we give up on this agenda? And you asked the same question in the room. Or should we redirect it? And how?
We should be redirecting it.
How then?
Let us be at the forefront of creating a new peace agenda. So this particular peace agenda came through Boutros Ghali's peace agenda in 1992. Not that we were not doing peacekeeping before that, but the nature of peacekeeping changed post that. The nature of mediation, etc., changed post that. It is not delivering sustainable peace. If more than 50% of our countries, despite peace building, go back into conflict, or if peace missions have to remain there for 20 years, there is something wrong with the way in which we are conducting this. Our toolbox is no longer appropriate. So can we rethink how we create peace? Can we rethink the peace table? Can there be different peace tables? Can there be multiple peace tables so that we don't just have the peace table at the national level, but we can have them at local levels? We can have national dialogues and these more exclusive peace processes taking place simultaneously. We are not thinking beyond what we have been given. We are simply saying, I want to be included. And we really need to think about the issue of changing power relations, changing the way in which we make peace, changing the way in which we create security. Now, we did move along, but with the threat of violent extremism, I think we have just gone way back to a pre-1990 discourse and practice in which violence through the military, through the police or other means is seen as the most appropriate response to people who are citizens. These are not foreign terrorists coming into our countries. These Al-Shabaab, they're the sons of the mothers who are there, for example. It doesn't mean that what they're doing is right and that we have to accept it, but we have to find different ways, except bomb them out of existence. That will temporarily put a band-aid on the problem, but the problem will expose again.
And how about men? When we talk about women, peace and security, should men be included?
So men have always been at the forefront of the peace and security agenda. Yeah? When we talk about including women, we focus on them precisely because they've been marginalized, they've been excluded in this. We are not saying that men cannot be part of the women, peace and security agenda. We are saying, one, that they come in to support the agenda. Because increasingly we see a situation where, and we know this, right? When men come into spaces, even if it's just one man, they tend to take over the space.
Yeah.
Right? So we also have to guard spaces that we have won hard. We need to know when to form alliances with men. We need to know when men need to deal with their own issues of masculinity in their separate spaces. And when we as women need to be alone to deal with how we're going to deal with patriarchy, for example,
Organize.
when we come together. So it's not an either-or situation. It is
strategic alliances.
Yeah, strategizing this, thinking through it more clearly. But just to say men must come on board, I don't think that's the appropriate response.
And the final question, we have talked about women, peace and security, but we are here in the framework of governance. What is the link between women, peace and security and governance?
That's a question, right? It is fundamentally a question about governance, right? What is creating gender equality? Who creates gender equality? That is a governance question, because when we talk about women, peace and security, we're not talking about it in the abstract. The larger agenda is one of gender equality, and that has to be foremost on the agenda of governance. Right? You can't talk about good governance when you're excluding half the population from governance.
It is also the agenda of power. Is there anything else you would like to add, or concluding words, remarks?
I think we've done a lot in terms of the women, peace and security agenda from where we were 17 years ago. So even though the numbers are not saying much, just in terms of people being aware of the agenda, okay, we've achieved a lot. As I indicated, the norm is there. Nobody can speak against the norm of gender equality. Nobody can speak against the norm of women's participation. And that is a major achievement, I would say. We have to now begin to strategize a little bit differently about transformation, about representation, and about responsiveness. Right? How do we make our militaries more responsive, gender responsive? Not just our militaries, our whole government, because even though we can show the numbers within government, we haven't been able to show as much in terms of the improvement of women's lives. They're still sitting with pretty much the same challenges, because much of that is happening in the home. And how do we deal with gender inequality in the home? And so we also have to look at those spaces. The war in the home was a catchy phrase that Gender Links threw up. So we have to put a whole lot of thought into bringing back some of the feminist theorization around issues of peace and security that can deal with these gender power relations. Because, and my final point is, patriarchy has learned to reinvent itself as well.
So, as a concluding word, we can say that having this agenda should start at home, because peace and security issues also start at home. So thank you so much, Professor Hendricks. It was great having you in this 30 Minutes With interview.
Thank you.